Social media has really given everybody the opportunity to express themselves and sometimes get an audience. In some cases, you look at the people who have big audiences, and you either wonder how or just feel terrified for the future. But there are certain things that you had to have before in order to get an audience. You had to go through editors, you had to go through whatever legacy media restrictions were. Today, there is less of that, and the results are for better or worse, but those are the results of where the culture is more than what kind of platform exists. The United Nations is always looking for ways to make all our lives supposedly much better. And they are now talking, not now, this has actually been around for a while, talking about the idea of how to prevent fake news and disinformation and so on. Now, this, remember, is the same organization that when you look at the reporting of the war in Israel and Gaza, you will see Hamas numbers posted as fact. This is the organization whose head said days after October 7th it didn't happen in a vacuum, and basically excused the atrocities. So yeah, do we need them to approve of what we say before we say it and police what we say? That's what we're going to discuss on today's episode of The Reality Show. I'm Razi Ginsburg. I'm joined by Marco and Richard, and for the first time on the show, Sean Malone. Sean, thank you for joining us. I will go to
Thank
you
you.
first. Your initial thoughts. We're going to see this clip of Guterres later on, but I wanted to get your initial thoughts first.
Yeah, I can't think of it's hard to think of an organization kind of worse than the UN on making, determinations for everyone, what is fact and what is false. I think anytime you have any kind of, even though the UN isn't officially a government, it's obviously very tied into a lot of international governments. It is, heavily involved in policy making across the world. And anytime you see a centralized authority like that starting to try to dictate what is true, what is not true, I get pretty concerned. So no, I don't think it's generally a good thing.
Yeah. Marco?
Well, what's the UN? The UN is not, it's not the Union of Nations. It's not a group of individuals getting together, work together. It's a club of states. It's full of failed politicians, full of failed technocrats, and unelected people, people who don't have a connection with individual on the ground. So everything that comes from them, more or less everything comes from them. You can guarantee it's poison. If anything else, because the group of states, which was set up in order to foster cooperation among people, has been kind of taken over by political power lusters, really. People who want to gain political power and people who want to impose a worldview on every nation. And because it's so far remote from any individual and therefore unelectable and unaccountable to individuals on the ground, becomes this kind of super state which wants to effectively control every single aspect of our lives. And it's clearly understood that behind political power is actually action, and behind action is ideas. So they want to screw down the opposition to their ideas. They know that some opposition idea to what they want and what they want to express it's been made more possible by the use of internet and various communication. So that they want to put a stamp on that, put a stop on it, and make sure they have the control of the ideas out there. They can tell you what to do and what to think. And we've seen how important it is, this kind of effectively the propaganda that they want to have the monopoly about, because we've seen that by keep pushing anti-Semitism and hate towards Israel, they've effectively compelled some people to behave in a way which conforms to their ideas. We've seen in DC with the murder of the two members of the Israeli embassy, and we've seen in Boulder with the attack last week. So Ideas matters, and behind everybody's actions, there are ideas. So if you control the ideas, you control the actions.
And of course, the whole idea of the UN itself is a flawed concept. It can't be made to work. It's not a question of we need the right leadership, we need the right person at the top. It's flawed from its inception, because you're bannering everybody, all the different nations of the world, under this one body, and that includes people. When we're talking about free speech, which is essentially what this topic is about, you've got on the one case, you've got America with its First Amendment. You've got, certain countries have common law, some have more Napoleonic law that's regulation based, some are out and out dictatorships, and you can't pretend that you can have an average of that lot. And one set of rules or one set of outlooks or even ideas or attitudes that matches them all. The truth is not an average of other people's opinions. And that's kind of what the UN is claiming it can be. And it's claiming it can represent a one truth represents all. And that's the truth as defined by the UN based on its own committees and ideas. And that is absolutely flawed from beginning to end. But of course, the onus is on the individual to use their own critical thinking in the first place, no matter where they come across any information, whether it's supplied by the UN, endorsed by the UN, whether it's a private company, whether it's a state national broadcaster or any of those things. All of them require the same level of onus on the individual to ascertain the validity of the source and to pull it in and weave it in with the rest of their knowledge to verify whether it's accurate or not. And that can't be done by diktat from anyone.
Yeah. Okay. There are some comments in the chat I want to get to, but let's hear from Guterres as well, so that we know what it is that we're talking about. Again, this is an old clip, but the policy is still relevant.
Digital platforms are being misused to subvert science and spread disinformation and hate to billions of people. This clear and present global threat demands clear and coordinated global action. Our policy brief on information integrity on digital platforms puts forward a framework for a concerned international response.
Well, the response of this channel is definitely concerned. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we can talk about the science part soon. The first thing that comes to mind, obviously, in today's context, and Paul in the chat says off topic, but have you heard Owen Jones won a journalism award for his coverage of Gaza? It's not off topic. Because, if this goes through, yeah, will it be a crime to say that Israel is not committing a genocide in Gaza? Will it be a crime to say that not a single shot was fired when 31 people supposedly were massacred on their way to getting humanitarian aid? Will it be a crime to question the 14,000 babies are going to die in the next 48 hours, which came from a UN official? Yeah, that is where we're headed, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen all this kind of stuff for many years, and it's like the Gaza War, I think, provides a really good example for a lot of these kinds of problems, especially because of how deeply involved UN officials are in that region and how deeply biased they clearly are in terms of the information that they're willing to support or promote. But I mean, you can see this across the board. America has had numerous examples for the last 20 plus years of major stories that a narrative was crafted within hours or maybe, a day, 24 hours of a story breaking, only to discover, a week later or 2 weeks later that none of it was true, or even in some cases months later. I mean, I think it's really dangerous to believe that your, first impression of something, particularly something that's sensational, something that you see on social media, whatever, must be true, and then to allow any kind of entity the power and the authority to say you aren't allowed to say anything else, you aren't allowed to question it, you'll be fined, you'll go to jail, you'll be booted from social media accounts, things like that. I mean, how many examples do you need from the Iraq War and weapons of mass destruction and things of that nature, all the way to, Nicholas Sandmann and Covington Catholic, to, the Duke Lacrosse case, or you can pick example after example after example and find instances where the truth is not apparent immediately, and you actually need to take some time to think about it and debate and discuss facts with other people, wait for additional facts to emerge. I mean, I think one of the problems with social media that we have quite a lot is the immediacy of people rushing to judgment on something where they only see a 30-second clip. And I think you see that with, going back to the Gaza situation quite often, right? You'll see a clip on social media that appears to be one thing, or that is framed in a particular way. Israeli soldiers fire on X number of people, or fire on children, or whatever it is, only to discover that that was footage taken 10 years ago in Syria, or whatever, right? Like these things happen so often that it is hard for me to imagine anyone who should ever be comfortable saying, yeah, we're going to define what is true and what is false, and we're going to regulate that across international borders. I mean, that is one of the most dystopian concepts I can think of, for sure.
Yeah. And we'll get into what the wider meaning for the UN is, and what I think where I think the US should step in. James Valiant in the chat says lies must be protected speech in most cases. Yeah, I mean, look, people who follow me on X and look at the replies I get see that I get, a good number of death threats slash death wishes a day, plus stuff about, can't wait for the second Holocaust, or the first one didn't happen, or your last name is proof that you're a demon who killed Jesus and is hiding behind rocks that'll tell us which rock it is. All that stuff. I can't imagine, wanting government to step in if somebody, issues a death threat. Maybe that's a different thing. But yeah, how is the Bible fake news, Marco?
Yeah, I mean, the UN is effectively putting out their guideline, which is to me is equivalent to the UN, sorry, the EU directives, which are kind of laws that the EU puts out there, but it's up to the single member state to implement it and codify them in their own each individual statute. So it's not imposed by the EU as such, but the member state has got a determined amount of time to embed that directive, which effectively becomes law in each individual state. So what the UN is doing here is creating this code of conduct, specifying. I mean, if you read it, looks like legalese and kind of makes sense if you just don't analyze it too much. But the idea is that they will force effectively member states, i.e. everyone, to implement this kind of legislation. We've seen already here in the UK, under the guise of child safety, the free speech on social platform, digital platform, has been effectively curtailed. The same thing went across the EU under the guise of market regulation. Free speech has been curtailed. So much so that here, for example, in the UK, BitChute no longer is available because they cannot put up the resources to comply with the legislation. So the effect of these things are pernicious, not just because they physically, but they literally affect the freedom of speech in whichever country happens to listen to them, but also creates this kind of believable framework where it's based on the definition of misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is the information which is being spread without the intent of telling a lie. If you make a mistake, if you believe that something is true, for example, religion, if you really believe God exists, you will put out there stuff relating to it, which is seen as misinformation because you didn't mean to mislead as such. You really believe this kind of stuff. While disinformation, you put out information because you effectively benefit from it, like religion. If you have some psychological material advantage from pushing out religious stuff, then you do that. I mean, honestly, it's just a pure, simple attack to free speech.
I think it's
And again,
interesting where we draw the line on some of those things too, because on an almost daily basis, I think I see things on social media, Facebook, whatever. Happened a couple of days ago. For those who don't know my background, which is probably most everyone in your audience, I am a creative director. I ran the creative media department for the Foundation for Economic Education for a long time, and I'm with a couple of other organizations now. But I started my career in music, and so I know I have a master's degree, I have a bachelor's degree in composition. I know music theory really well, and almost once a year or maybe more, I see some of the most bizarre conspiracy theories about music that you've ever heard. Things like certain pitches being magically curing cancer and things like that. All kinds of really wacky things. And the other day I saw somebody post something about the frequency that is emitted perhaps by fruits and vegetables and like the fabric that you wear and things like this. None of that is ever fact checked, right? Like you will never see social media go, oh, we've got to shut this down. It's only political narrative stuff typically, right? So like the even the quest for rooting out misinformation, I think, is quite often fake, right? Like it's almost always narrative control, because if it wasn't, they would engage teams on scientific questions. They would engage teams on other questions that are actually quite a lot easier to navigate in terms of what we know and don't know, already about the world. And I just find it really fascinating where those terms, misinformation and disinformation both, get used as a cudgel more than they are used to actually define anything real.
Uh, Conspiracy theories in music sounds like an episode that needs to be done on its
It,
own, as well as maybe a separate one for how
I
fruits
will
and
happily come
vegetables.
back for that episode. That it is wacky. There's some really crazy stuff out there.
I look forward to that episode. Richard.
yeah, I mean, clearly it must be. It's not the Jews behind everything; it's the radishes and the cabbages that are that are running us all and pulling the strings.
Yeah.
Um, I think. I mean, both the terms misinformation and disinformation are pretty bogus terms in the first place, aren't they? And I think that even the term propaganda I've heard described when you look at how concepts are formed. I don't want to get deep into the weeds of philosophy or into objectivism for this, but simply the fact that you need to have a certain amount of concepts below it in order to form a concept. And if you've got a concept like propaganda, you've already built into it a sense of what lies and truth before you've even established what is truth and what is lies. And I think the question to be asked and answered every time is true by what standard? By what standard is it misinformation? By what standard is it disinformation? How are you pretending that you can say exactly what the intent of the author was, what their context of knowledge was at the time, what they were aware of, what they were trying or not trying to do, and judge them for that on the basis of a set of words, which is ultimately what we're talking about? I think one of the things that I notice here is that take the case of Lucy Connolly here in the UK. Now she's the woman who's in prison for 31 months for sending a single tweet, and she's the wife of a councillor, a Conservative councillor, which of course shouldn't be remotely relevant to what she's done, but is mentioned every single time that her name is brought up. And of course, what she did was she tweeted after the Southport attacks. Where 3 young girls were murdered in the UK. She tweeted about asylum hotels being, if they were set on fire, they could be set on fire for all I care, was the phrase she used. Now that in itself, the for all I care, was enough to make it be interpreted as if she was inciting people to set those.
And she deleted that when she realized what she had tweeted a few hours later.
And this is the point. Within 4 hours, she deleted it. But an individual on social media is not allowed to retract something but a media company like a legacy media like the BBC can stick up a story that is false that sits there for like 24 hours or longer, and in other organisations' senses is still on the internet in various forms, even though and a retraction is then printed or delivered, and they're allowed an apology is enough. An apology is enough in that context, but for an individual to remove the thing or say I was wrong or take it down, that's not enough. Now that's a
Incidentally, I have this up on my screen here right now. But the not last year, but the year before in 2023, if this is correct, the United Kingdom arrested 12,183 people, which is 33 a day under the Malicious Communications Act, just in 2023. You know, 12
and,
over 12,000 people.
and the key word in there is arrest, because
Yeah,
arrest is not the same as charge, but
right.
it is the same as the state coming and knocking on your door and
It's incredibly
intimidating.
chilling.
Absolutely, and making you censor yourself, which is the ultimate aim.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a tremendous stat that you never hear anywhere. And honestly, I've had conversations with people, people in the EU, people in Britain who will say, "Oh, we have free countries over here. We have free speech. We have all these things." And you're like, you're arresting 12,000 people a year over speech, and who knows? Maybe some of those are death threats. Maybe some of those are credible, something that's actually really, really serious. But I mean, there are so many cases like the one you just described where it's just somebody making a joke, like Count Dankula's pug, things like that, or somebody making a statement that's purely an opinion, and you're not allowed to have an opinion on certain topics
Yeah.
without the state possibly coming to your door
By the way,
and
Count
locking you
Dankula
up.
was one of the ones convicted for teaching his dog the Nazi salute. Not
Yeah,
a particularly funny joke, but not in, again, in
yeah.
America, you have actually, let me get to America in a second. Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat. Jonathan, Jonathan and I, a couple of days ago on a show, were talking about um, how difficult it would be to actually boycott Israel if you wanted to boycott everything, that's in any way Israeli. And I mentioned, cherry tomatoes are an Israeli invention. So yeah, that kind of brings me back to this, the fruit and vegetable is actually, sending out. Yeah, that's the Jews, people.
Are you controlling the
That's a joke,
frequencies in the
government.
cherry
Those,
tomatoes? That's the real question. You
sorry.
need the right frequencies coming
Yeah.
through
Well.
those tomatoes.
But look, that's the thing. In America, you have a First Amendment. This is incompatible with that.
Yeah.
And it brings me again to the point, and we've been criticizing Trump a lot. There are things I hope Trump will do, maybe not for the right reasons, but one of them is, and I like what he's doing with, sanctioning people in the International Court of Justice and really enemies of the West. What needs to happen, Sean? You're in the United States of America. What needs to happen for the UN to take its rightful place away from, Manhattan? Like you're in Manhattan, and put them in that. My suggestion is the new headquarters should be that, that building, the hotel in North Korea in Pyongyang that has been empty for 30 years since it was built. Looks like a rocket. That's the perfect place. What needs to happen for the US to say enough is enough, no more of our money, and get out of our country?
I don't know because I mean it's funny where we're talking about the definition of words like propaganda and things like that, which do have a place, I think, in some cases. And one of those cases I would argue is model UN, right? And the way that the United Nations and the US government, a bunch of other governments around the world treat the United Nations as this unbiased, totally fair, representative society that is, always looking at the best for the entire world. And if you look at, people who grow up doing model UN and things like that, it's all hyper idealized, right? Like it's all as if this is functioning not in a public choice context where people actually have, you know, they have their own self-interested motivations, and they have their own reasons for supporting these bills or those laws or these policies and this kind of thing. Quite often, which is really, I'm from Egypt and this benefits our government, or I'm from North Korea and this benefits our government, or whatever. But no, I don't know, because you would think that after so many scandals, going back to the 1990s and earlier, well, and, really to the very beginning of the UN, I just don't know how you can look at it and think that its claim of what it does and what it's for is true, because it doesn't function the way that they claim really ever. It doesn't seem to prevent war. It doesn't seem to, help people navigate trade deals. It doesn't help people find peace between nations in particular. It seems to usually just help prop up dictatorships for the most part. And if you look at that history of the UN, I can't find a justification for keeping it, let alone keeping it in New York. I mean, but I have no idea. I mean, I think the general public is so, I think they're so distanced from it, and they just don't care about the UN that much, other than to have in the back of their mind this sort of very fluffy idea that it's just this lovely, wonderful place for people to come together and find world peace, which it's never achieved even slightly. So I don't know. I mean, I wish I had like some answer that was like, if we do this, we can eject this organization from the United States. We can't. I mean, I just don't know how you would do it. You got to get politicians to actually make it an issue, and or cultural figures to actually make it an issue, and you just hardly ever see that.
We need to get Guterres to really insult Trump, and I think that might help.
That would do it,
When I
maybe.
suggested getting rid of the UN, somebody in the chat says, "Yeah, that's dumb. We're not getting out of the UN." Thank you for that well thought out
Yeah.
argument, Marco. He was talking about science in the clip that we saw, and I'm thinking about the first thing I think about is Climategate in this country, where this was 16 years ago, right? Where basically climate researchers who are the people we're relying on for information about how we are ruining the planet. Some emails were hacked, and it came out that they were talking about how do we push this through, even though it's not true. Uh, but of course, when Gutierrez talks about science, it's probably more anybody who not just questions the science around global warming, but questions the policies that follow the only acceptable scientific outcomes of scientific research on this topic. Marco.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the IPCC, the body that imposes all this climate bullshit on the rest of the world, it's actually a UN institution backed by the UN itself.
Yeah.
But cast your mind only 5 years ago, during this pandemic, the COVID stuff. I mean, the lockdown was policy pushed by the WHO, which is another UN body. Do you remember when people were questioning, hang on a second, started in Wuhan, there is a research institute in there, perhaps started with a lab leak. You were shut down straight away. Government were leaning on to a private company to shut down the debate in the first place. The variant of the virus itself was down. Each variant had identified a Greek letter. When it came to Xi, which sounds so much like Xi Jinping, the Chinese dictator, they decided to skip that one and go to the next letter. I mean, all this kind of stuff is so politicized that you can't even imagine how much politics goes on in there, and stuff that shouldn't be involved at all. But of course, and Gutierrez quite cleverly uses the word clear and present threat, because under clear and present danger, even certain privileges from the US Constitution can be effectively suspended. If you are under certain threat, clear and present danger, the president himself has got special power that he can call on and effectively steamroll over legislation. So he's doing on purpose. He knows exactly what he's doing by making it look like there is a clear and present threat to information and knowledge and science and all this kind of stuff. Is effectively saying, I want special powers so I can squash all over the freedom of speech. And the freedom of speech is effectively, ultimately, is a freedom to act. It's what allows you to be free to think and to do what's best for you. As an individual, you need freedom to function. And the whole idea, the ideas have to be out there. I mean, by any means, come out with the stupidest theory you can come up with, because once we're allowed to debate them, we're allowed to listen to them, evaluate them, and counter them, stupid ideas will die. I mean, you know, the frequency stop. It's like, yeah, that's very funny, but shut up, you know. But by not doing that, by stopping people being able to say what they think things might be, what their experience or what the data tells them, what they've discovered. But by putting this under wrap and by only the official authorized truth comes out, well, that's pure fascism.
And of course, I think it's you hinted at it earlier, Sean, when you were talking about how Americans see the UN as this fluffy body, and that's part of the problem is the fact that there is a disinterest and an absence of focused minds or active minds looking at what's actually going on right under your own nose, because this is all happens in plain sight. So that, you know, but whatever people talk about, you know, the hidden elite or whatever, they're missing what's happening in plain sight. They produce full reports, like the nature that we're talking about here, for example, of which exactly lays out what they intend to do. So it is there for people to see, but because it's buried in boring legalese, and because it's not called what it really is most of the time, it's always badged as a good intention, isn't it? Never badged under the censorship term, never you know, overtly said, we're going to stop you from doing X, Y, and Z. It's always about what it's, you know, will supposedly enable you to do, which you're actually already able to do anyway. I think that combined with the fact that people are quite easily led when they are told to focus on one particular area. So they're like, the way it's pulled across on you is it's always willfully myopic, very narrowly focused on one particular case. Who could be against trying to stop the exploitation of children? Who could possibly be against, you know, this other case? And then once you agree to that, you've effectively solved the entire principle down the river with it, and you won't be able to say anything, you know, in any form. That's the problem that takes place here, because people view the UN in that fluffy bucket. Like, they don't distinguish between the Peace Corps and the UN or the Boy Scouts or whatever, any organization that seems to be doing friendly, happy things for the good of humanity, that humanitarian banner that sits above everything, which whitewashes everything that is done in its name. But of course, it is the altruism underneath that is actually the cause of the corrosive nature of what's being done in all our names for our own collective good, which involves sacrificing our individual freedom.
Yeah, Marco, you brought up COVID, and another facet of all of this that's really interesting to me is how many private organizations, particularly media organizations and social media companies, actively participated in the censorship of a lot of those ideas, right? I have multiple YouTube videos that are still, to this day, age restricted. They don't contain any violence or sexual content or nudity or foul language or anything. They would be perfectly G-rated. They merely challenge the policy of lockdowns, and in several cases criticize or in some cases just predict the outcomes that we actually did see, like, you know, significant economic harm, significant social harm, significant harm to students being educated in public schools, significant harm to, you know, people who had faced depression and suicidal thoughts and things of that nature. And talking about that stuff got you completely if not demonetized or age restricted or blocked, outright banned from a lot of social media networks. And then, of course, only, it takes a year or so before we start seeing evidence of the government actually pushing for those companies to have those policies. And even once that happened, and once all that came out, you had a huge swath of the population in the United States, at least, I'm sure, all over the world, that just denied that that happened outright. Like they just flat out said, oh, no, no, the government didn't pressure anybody into doing this. It's not a free speech. It's not a First Amendment violation. It's not a real problem for free speech because they're private companies. They can do whatever they want. But the reality is, it still came down to the basically the narrative that was being directed by government, directed by world organizations like the WEF and World Health Organization and the UN, and all of those policies were being filtered right into social media company decision making, and I don't think we can separate those two necessarily, especially when you have direct evidence of at least the United States government, I'm sure, British government, I'm sure many other governments around the world actively trying to censor and to pressure companies to stop people from saying certain things. It can go there very, very fast, as we've seen in the last 5 years.
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg, when he went full right-wing Giga Chad, whatever the young people are calling it, he said, oh yeah, we lost Mark and Richard. This censorship is already working, but they will be back soon. He said would get phone calls like to Facebook offices from government telling us get rid of this stuff, and that
Right.
is terrifying. And again, Facebook
Yeah.
should do it probably if the government calls you. Government has the power of the gun. You're
Yeah.
not responsible if government threatens you. This channel has over 4,000 videos. Only two of them, I believe, have ever been removed by YouTube. Um, One was removed in May 2021 when it was titled "The Anti-Vaxxers' War on Reality," and it started with us reading a tweet from an anti-vaxxer London mayoral candidate, and the rest of it was us criticizing the tweet. But
This has
it,
happened to me more times than I can count. On Facebook, particularly, there have been numerous cases where I've had fact checks applied to posts, which, by the way, it changes the way that Facebook assesses your page and how often they'll share your content to your followers and things like that. And in every single case that that has happened to me, I'm fairly confident it has been me criticizing the underlying post. Like it's me agreeing with Facebook in many cases that it was not factual, but my post was a detailed criticism of this thing. And it still gets flagged because these systems not only, I think, are problematic for philosophical reasons, they're also just badly done. They're badly designed because when you're trying to automate restrictions on speech, automation does not handle context well. It does not handle nuance well. It doesn't handle understanding, jokes or sarcasm or, any of a large number of ways, metaphor, similes, irony, like all of these kinds of things tend to be above what any kind of automated censorship algorithm is capable of assessing. And yet,
yeah,
that's kind of what we've done. We've now created an internet that's full of these kinds of automated bots going trolling the internet, trying to dictate what people can say or can't say, and they get it wrong constantly.
yeah, and of course, in some cases, you then have it manually reviewed. The episode we had removed, the anti-vaxxers' war in reality, was in
Yeah,
May 2021. We appealed the decision. That's still pending, but I'm sure any day now it'll be up again. Thank you, Bonnie, for the
right.
super chat. Thank you, PC, for the super chat. PC says UN is poo. PC, since technically the UN isn't literally feces,
I
I
know.
believe this is fake news and expect a knock on your door any
That's right.
moment now. Marco and Richard, you're back. Let's hear from you before the UN kicks you out of this call again.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was talking about UN institution in Iran. Of course, I forgot UNRWA. I mean,
Yeah,
UNRWA has been involved a number of
yeah.
times, have been proven to be uh, involved in with Hamas. Hamas has been using UNRWA, have been using UN resources, resources which we are forced to provide to the UN. because our nations collect tax from us and then passes on to the UN. So part of our money has literally gone directly to Hamas in order to wage war against Israel. And we've been told that, oh, this is not true, all this kind of stuff. And that came from the very same people who are now ranting and raving against opposition to their propaganda. So, that's quite obvious.
And I think when it comes to particularly social media and what people do or don't say on social media and all that kind of stuff, well, a lot of the time, what you're actually looking at is the proliferation of regulation and new laws, which is completely unnecessary. And the existing principles are enough to decide if something is a crime or not. And you don't need to keep legislating for 10,000 different individual, slightly nuanced, different sets of cases, because part of the reason why I think they tend towards doing that, particularly in Europe, less so perhaps in America, you're fortunate in that with your constitution, but in Europe, certainly they do that in order to make it unclear to the individual exactly what the law is. Because so long as the law is obtuse and vague, and you're not sure whether you're on the right side of it or not, you're in a Kafkaesque world where you end up self-policing and you become sanctioning your own oppression, which is what happens all the time.
Rossi and I were talking just before you guys got back about instances where our respective channels have faced some of these kinds of problems. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is there's almost never really an appeal process. Like they always claim that you can get a human reviewer to come look at your thing. Maybe, possibly, maybe it'll happen in 5 years. Maybe it'll never happen. You really don't know. But in many cases, I have explicitly asked for clarity on those kinds of questions, right? Like, what is it specifically that I was not supposed to say in this video or in this post or whatever? And if I can actually talk to anybody, they'll never give you an answer directly. They'll say, well, I'm not allowed to reveal the details of our policy. We've just determined that it violates the policy. And look, okay, this is where you come back and you say it's a private organization. It is not bound by the United States Constitution. It does not have to give me due process. I'm on YouTube or whatever. YouTube could boot me out for any reason that YouTube feels like. But as a principal issue and as a question for societies and cultures in general, like, the reason that we established due process is because we recognized that punishing people for things that they don't know what they're being charged with, that they don't have a chance to defend themselves against, we recognize that these are bad things. We recognize that these are really good ways, very easy ways of punishing innocent people for things that they did not do. Or things that aren't even crimes in the first place or shouldn't be crimes in the first place, and yet we don't apply those standards across the board. And when people expect some modicum of that at, say, a college or a university or on social media or, in the press or whatever, you just get snubbed on a lot of these kinds of things, and people just kind of laugh and say, oh, we don't need to do that. Well, I kind of think you do need to do that. I think before you start booting people off of, my preference would be for every social media network and every broadcasting network to kind of have a similar kind of due process standard in place where you say, if we're going to kick you off for, let's say, a threat to somebody, I want to actually see that adjudicated in some way. It doesn't have to be in a court necessarily, but I think allowing people to know what they're being accused of, allowing people the opportunity to defend themselves, and then also reining in those policies to where you're not actually trying to police narrative, but you're only trying to police things where somebody is trying to, threaten somebody or hurt somebody or harass them in a legally actionable kind of way, or, hurting children and things like that. But like, that's not what we do for the most part. We have these really broad blanket policies that can then, like you said, they're Kafkaesque, but they can get applied to anyone at any time. And so you just don't know if you're going to be in violation of one of these rules or not. You don't even know what the rules are.
Yeah, yeah. As I mentioned, well, I mentioned the one video we had from May 2021 where I appealed the next day, and that's still pending. There was another one also, COVID or lockdown or something related, that last year got removed, but it was again from 2021 or 2020, and
Yeah.
I don't even remember if I appealed at that point. I'm like, why even bother? Thank you, PC, for another super chat. PC says. Razi, I have one thing to say about UNRWA defund. Well, I have more things to say, but this is a family show, so I'm gonna save it. Um, Marco.
Yeah, well, you were talking about rules. Well, when it comes to social platform, you can always choose to go to somebody else. If you're not clear about, YouTube rules, you can go to somebody else. But of course, when it comes to government, for example, here in Britain, recently there was a case of a Turkish citizen who went in front of the embassy of Turkey, and in order to protest about the Islamification of Turkey itself, our Erdogan is importing more and more Sharia stuff in the day-to-day running of Turkey. He burnt the Quran in front of it. Now, the judge slammed into jail, of course, but the rationale was not because he burned the Quran, we are free to burn the Quran. There is, we haven't got, according to the judge, blasphemy laws, but he kind of found him guilty because he did it in a way that Muslim people might have come across it and will get offended. So effectively, judge said there's no blasphemy law, but you can burn a Quran in London. Now, try
There's
and
no
burn,
blasphemy law, but you can't offend anyone,
yeah, try and burn a Quran
right?
in London without coming across a Muslim who will get offended. I mean, come on, guys. So this continuous attack to our freedom of speech, which has been eroded bit by bit by bit. And now, because of sectarian politics, because of the kind of immigration we had here in Europe, especially, we are finding a proper conflict there. There are two cultures which are not really compatible, which at some point will come to a hand. I hope. I said it a number of times. I hope it's not going to be in a violent way, but you have to resolve the conflict. You cannot, in our society, have the conflicting ideas. We must break the glass ceiling for women, and at the same time allow women to, by a section of the community, to be treated like second-class citizens. You cannot rant and rave about animal rights and then allow the same section of community to torture animals for slaughter. I mean, these things will come to a head at some point.
I
But
have a question for you, for really everybody here. Like, are you surprised after Charlie Hebdo? Are you surprised at the direction that things went? Because I think when that happened, I would have really thought that there would have been a little bit of a rallying around free speech and a little bit of a rallying around the idea that, like, you should be allowed to offend somebody without them murdering you. Like this should be a really fundamental protected thing in a free society, right? Is that, like, if I say something or if I offend your religion or whatever, you know, that's not a murderable offense. Like that's not something you get to do. And yet I feel like the UK especially, and again, I'm a little bit less familiar with the rest of Europe, but I mean, I think in the UK especially, I could easily see Charlie Hebdo type of a type of attack happening again, and it has happened multiple times. I mean, uh, Salman Rushdie just got stabbed the other day. Also, I mean, so these things have really just came full circle to me, and yet at the time, 15 years ago or what, I would have thought for sure we'd have seen much more support for free speech, in the intervening years. And I don't know. I'm curious as to how surprised you guys are about that.
well, not that surprised at all. Take Charlie Hebdo, for example. Only a few years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago, a British teacher was showing during a class about free speech in a school in the Midlands here in England, a picture of Mohammed talking about censorship and stuff like that. And after the protest of the parents of these kids, the guy has to be in hiding because it has effectively a threat of beheadings because of what he's done. in a class setting. I mean, we are at this level here in Britain. France, another teacher has been actually beheaded because of having the temerity of talking to his kids about this kind of breach of freedom of speech. But then again, are we surprised after October, 9/11? We've seen the reaction there. We've seen that the people from the culture who perpetrated the atrocity suddenly became the victim. Suddenly, Islamophobia became a thing, and suddenly, Islam was under attack. It's like, what? And just because we didn't have the spine to stand up to it, and like we don't have the spine now with the conflict Gaza-Israel, to say, hang on a second, Israel is fighting as a democratic country against a total dictatorship. So what's there to debate?
Yeah.
And you have
I've wondered that for, the entire duration of the war to a degree is like, you're looking at a society that is, for all intents and purposes, essentially a modern Western liberal democracy. It allows all kinds of it allows generally the same rights for every ethnic group. It does not have a lot of problems with gay rights or women's rights or discrimination. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of discrimination problems in the country, but like the policy at the policy level, it is not, it's night and day between that and, Palestine or Jordan or Egypt or, you name any of the neighboring countries around there. Not to mention most of the rest of the Middle East or Iran or Afghanistan, or, you can keep spreading out, from that region, and you find, totalitarian theocracy after totalitarian theocracy. And then you have one tiny sliver of a relatively liberal democracy in that region that even still allows full citizenship to, Arab Muslims. I don't I don't see the moral equivalence in any of that, and that's even discounting the fact that Hamas very clearly started it, and so they started a war and now are losing a war, and I don't know. I've struggled to wrap my brain around how many people seem to have this, at least to me, fairly morally backwards in a lot of cases. I
Well,
just I'm really baffled by that in this
so
whole thing.
I have an answer to the Charlie Hebdo question, but I want to go to Richard first, and then I will tell you my experience from back then.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the key thing that I noticed out of the Charlie Hebdo thing was how swiftly there was a coordinated effort to work out how we're going to respond to this. And they came up with the Je suis Charlie vacuous sloganeering that people wore and spouted on everything, the same way they do the teddy bears and candles incident, after a big terrorist attack, and then move on as quickly as possible. It means that they never actually identify the principle which they're claiming to stand behind, or semi-claiming to stand behind, or ought to be claiming to stand behind, which is freedom of speech. It didn't say freedom, I believe in freedom of speech on those t-shirts. It said a phrase which doesn't mean anything to anyone. And therefore they weren't even at that stage. And bear in mind, we're talking back in, what was it, 2015? So you're a good 10 years on from then, and yet that was a very early indicator of the direction we were heading in, which was one of cowardice, evasion, avoidance, and never naming the problem, let alone working out what the solution should be. So in that sense, it was eye-opening, but it's only got worse since. And for me, the shocking one was the Ariana Grande concert, seeing a load of kids blown up at a concert, and seeing how swiftly life returned to, yeah, that was last week. We don't need to worry about that now. That's old news. How swiftly that occurred, I found truly shocking.
Yeah, I agree, and yeah, the Je suis Charlie was also one of the notes I had. I mean, you had people holding these, posters saying Je suis Charlie, and I am Charlie, and obviously you're not, because if you were, you would be holding a cartoon of Muhammad, because that's what they were killed for. So the whole thing was absolutely ridiculous. But I remember, and I've mentioned this on the show watching. So that attack was on a Tuesday. On Thursday here in the UK on BBC One, there's a show Question Time, one of the most important shows in British politics, if not the most important. You have three politicians from basically three prominent politicians, one from each party. You have kind of a journalist from the right and a journalist from the left, if you can call these things that. And so they had Mehdi Hassan on, who was this was before his U.S. career, and the first thing he said was, just because it's not illegal to fart in an elevator doesn't mean you have to do it. That was his immediate response is, yeah, they didn't break any laws, but they did something wrong, and that's why they were killed. And yeah, that unfortunately I think is the response to that attack in a nutshell. Anyway, yeah, this depressing topic will come up again. But for today, Sean, parting thoughts, and can you tell our audience where they can find you?
Yeah. I mean, look, I guess parting thoughts are just, I think we all have agreed consistently here. Free speech is so critically important. And I think people need to spend, at least in America especially, people think of free speech as the First Amendment. And that I think is a mistake. I think you need to think of free speech as a principle, and the First Amendment being a legal attempt to uphold that principle nationwide. And if you understand that those are actually two distinct things, then when we start talking about how policies should be enacted, not only at the government level, but also what do you do in your personal life? What do you do? Like, do you shout at your friends and tell them to shut up when they say things that you don't like? I hope you don't do that, right? Like, I hope that you actually want to listen to what other people have to say. And I hope that you want to explore the world and inspect other people's ideas enough and respect other people enough that you give them the freedom to say what they want, so that you also have the freedom to say what you want, and then determine what is true based on that interplay of ideas and debate and argument and all of those kinds of things. And I think anytime I see the UN or, the World Health Organization or anybody trying to silence people, it's almost always an indicator to me that there's something that they emphatically have that they don't want us to talk about or don't want you to talk about in a way that's probably political, probably propagandistic, probably a lie. So I think we should generally be incredibly wary, and also just flip your initial assumptions on its head, right? Do not assume that the UN is trying to save children with their policies. Assume that they are trying to control speech, and they're using some fluffy argument to try to make it palatable to do that. And I think if we constantly maintain more skepticism, I think that'd be a lot better. As for where to find me, it's actually harder than it used to be, because I used to be routinely on YouTube at Out of Frame or youtube.com/beonline. I still produce Common Sense Soapbox, which is youtube.com/Common Sense Soapbox. And then also you can find me on Twitter at Citizen A Media on Twitter and elsewhere. But yeah.
Those links will be in the description. WUB says, this depressing topic will come up again as the leitmotif of the channel. Look, Greta is about to arrive in Gaza, so maybe there will be some good news over the weekend on the channel. Marco, Richard, parting thoughts, and where can people find you?
Yeah, this is a point where you hope the Houthi ballistic missile just overshoots Gaza and hits a boat, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, freedom of speech is not a luxury. It's not something that comes from legislation, and it's not something that should be abridged, limited, short of course, inciting violence and stuff like that. That's no longer freedom of speech. That's violence. But freedom of speech is an essential thing that allows us to effectively take the actions that allows us to prosper. To make the kind of to think freely without being curtailed by anyone. And to be honest, as Ayn Rand pointed out, the most frightening words you can hear is "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you," and that's what the UN does every time it gets in the way, really.
And I think there are much wider problems than this. This is a sample of it, isn't it? Because ultimately, the bigger issue is justice, and that's what we're not seeing a lot of across, the whole spectrum. I think at the same time as you're seeing thought crimes being cracked down upon and over policed and elevated to be the most important crimes, you're seeing real world crimes being lessened and denigrated and not treated properly. Everything from, all the euphemisms that are used for it, whether it's fare evasion, which really means theft. So you just a euphemism for theft, or whether it's grooming gangs as a euphemism for rape. All of these things are being lessened in the real world and given sometimes even lesser sentences than one woman, with a single tweet, like we mentioned earlier. And it's that injustice that I think is something that we need to highlight and argue in every conversation, not just when we're speaking on through YouTube, but to friends and family, and to point out the inconsistencies that exist, those contradictions that shouldn't be there. Not only to talk about the one isolated case that somebody would love you focus on solely, and ignore the principle behind it, because there's principles that count. In terms of where can you find us, the Briefly Objective is packed with lots of little short clips taken from conversations on this channel with added visuals that hopefully really gets through to identifying and highlighting those principles.
Marco, did you just attribute a Ronald Reagan quote to Ayn Rand, or was I mistaken there?
Oh, sorry. Well, it's
Okay,
the
no,
Ayn Rand
no.
Center UK, so read Ayn
But
Rand.
but it is a good quote either way. Yeah, to the
Rand would
person in the
approve.
chat. Sorry.
Rand would approve, I
Yeah.
think.
To the person in the chat who spent the whole show advocating segregation, we advocate for property rights. We're all for you getting your own property, segregating yourself from all races. The world will become a better place. Thanks, guys, for joining me. Thanks, everybody, for watching. I'm Razi Ginsburg on X. Yeah, if you want to see a broad range of death threats and anti-Semitic abuse, look at the replies that I get. It's sometimes entertaining, sometimes scary, and a sign of our times. Either way, we're back tomorrow with the Daily Objective. We'll see you then.